Okay, so welcome everyone. As we take an opportunity to go through the purchase agreement form provided by the Michigan Realtors, I'm going to be um, just basically going through the document, and then if at any point you want to stop me and ask questions, the whole idea is we need to be as comfortable with the language in it as we can. And so that's basically the goal for today. So I'm going to share my screen. And so, yeah, all right. To start out, we're going to be working out of Remine, but obviously, if you use a different transaction management system like Dotloop or whatever, it totally fine. Just Remine is what I utilize and where I have access to it. Just to give you a quick little peek, I have a buyer package that I've created just as my default, and in it is purchase agreement form A. And so um, now I'm going to show you where to find that. But if you haven't already done so, I recommend you create a package in your transaction management system that already has, especially all of these documents up at the top. These you need to be able to turn in when you have a pending deal in order to have a complete file, along with these if they're applicable. The ones that I have customized, so that way then I have certain things done to it. So that way then, whenever I start a new transaction, it's already has those things ready to go. That's what that means. So I'm going to show you where to find, at least in Remind, and probably the same for all the others. Um, the form is found in the RealComp filing cabinet and then in the Michigan Association of Realtors folder. You scroll down to purchase agreement alphabetically, purchase agreement form A, and the form is right here. So now this form, if we were to look, it's not branded yet in Remind. It's once we apply it to a transaction folder that it adds our Remax logo and all that. But you see right here, and you could use it now or download the blank PDF that's unbranded if you wanted to print it out and bring it with you. Just having a copy of this in your car is probably a good idea, just in case you happen to find yourself in a situation where you need to write up an offer really quickly and you don't have time to get in front of a computer. Having a blank form printed out, not a bad insurance policy. But yes, so quick recap: the form is found in the RealComp filing cabinet, Michigan Association of Realtors folder, and then the purchase agreement form A, which we also utilize in this folder. We like to use the form JJ-1 as the buyer contract. And then we have the buyer broker compensation addendum or compensation agreement between brokers, which we will deal with those during this class as well. All right, so let's pretend though, brand new transaction. We're going to be on the buying side. And I'm just going to do whatever random house. All right. So here I'm going to grab from my packages, going to do the ultimate buyer package. So I'm just taking all these forms already, and they are customized since I'm grabbing it from my package. And all right, so here it is. So any questions before I open up the form and we start going through the language within it? Did I lose anybody as to why I just showed you how to create a new transaction and grab this form to use in this situation? Okay, so now we got the branding on it because it's a new transaction. So let's just go line by line to make sure we're all in agreement as to what the language of this document says. It's a 7-page purchase agreement, which is longer than some of the others like the LCAR one and GMAR, the internal Remax one that we've used. This one is longer. The reason why is that this is a purchase agreement made from the state association so that it could be used anywhere in the state. And different municipalities and counties, they have factors that influence what you would anticipate seeing in a purchase agreement based on that geography. And so for this form to be able to apply wherever you're writing it, they had to overcompensate a little bit, but that's totally fine because it's always something that we can pare down to use how we want. All right, so the offer date, obviously, the date that we are writing the offer, but the effective date of this agreement will be the date of final acceptance. So whenever you have the contingencies that reference the number of days, that is going to be based on the effective date, and it's going to be referencing to calendar days. That's good to know. Very clear and straightforward, getting that out of the way so there's no debate later on whether that was business days. It's all calendar days here. Property description. All this is, describing what is included in this purchase agreement. So the property itself, and then you have all the boilerplate of the fixtures, and then you're going to have the inclusions like the appliances, but then that does not include if you're trying to actually get rid of any of the boilerplate above, like the window curtains in the primary bedroom or something like that. You would need to exclude them down here. So normally it says exclusion. Here, this one uses language does not include. Six in one hand, half dozen in the other. The purchase price, straightforward. Concessions, if any. So they go straight up at the very beginning, seller to contribute 3% of the purchase price towards buyer's closing costs, prepaids, proration taxes. You'd be putting it in right here up front, which I think is actually a useful spot for it, because it's so relevant to the purchase price. What the sellers are most interested in is what the net purchase price is. So if you're going to have seller concessions to help with the buyer's closing costs, it's good for that to be clear from the get-go. Method of payment, we have cash. New mortgage is typically what you'd be choosing. And so then let's say a conventional mortgage loan in the amount of 80% of the purchase price. Buyer will provide evidence of mortgage application and appraisal order. So this makes it, though, a little strange that you're telling them how quickly you're even going to order the appraisal. Because normally, a lot of other purchase agreements, they only talk about the mortgage application. And so then I used to always do 5 days for the mortgage application. But if it's going to be the appraisal as well, then I'm going to say 10 days here, because I don't have my buyers order the appraisal until after the inspection is satisfied, and hope, as we're writing the offer, we're hoping that the inspection gets cleared up within 10 days. Any questions on that? And I'm not saying that this is the right number for you to put in here. That's just, in my view, what I'd be doing. But feel free to stop me if you want to discuss at all. If buyer fails to deliver seller evidence of the loan approval before, and this is where you put in the date, seller may terminate this agreement by written notice to the buyer. So this does give them, in theory, the ability to cancel. So I used to do about 45 days in this box, but it's one that is tricky, and you need to know whatever date you're putting in here. So if I do November, let's go November 22nd. Then in theory, if November 22nd comes and goes and we don't have a loan approval, it's giving the seller the option to terminate. Whether or not that's a hard, fast seller option. I mean, the courts have typically determined that if the buyers are still making a good faith effort, the sellers may not be able to terminate on November 23rd, but it's something that you need to let your buyers know is a potential litigation issue that may arise. Any thoughts? Nope. Okay. So the closing date, sale to be closed on or before, I'd probably be putting the same thing or earlier. I mean, I think it's totally fine if you have this be, the padded amount, whereas then the closing date, you can think, okay, we're going to try to close by the 15th. But now there's nothing in here that says if the 15th comes and goes without closing, that the seller may terminate the agreement. That is up here. So that's where I personally think having the higher, the further out number up here is the safer, better option. And keep in mind also, this is not about the closing date. This is just getting the loan approval. So if you get the clear to close on November 22nd or November 21st, because it says before. So if you have the clear to close on November 21st, even if the title companies can't make the closing happen on the 22nd, needs to be extended to the next week. The seller can't terminate because, hey, we have the loan approval at that point. And even though the closing date here, that this doesn't give them, there's no language here giving the seller an out. So that's how I'm interpreting this. All right, condition of the property. Buyer accepts the property in its as-is present condition, subject to any inspection contingencies below. Pretty standard. Buyer agrees there are no additional written or oral understandings except as expressly provided in this agreement. So it agrees that at the time of surrender of possession, the property shall be in the same condition as it is now, with the exception of ordinary wear and tear. So the seller is agreeing to give the home over in its current state. So they are responsible if any new damage outside of ordinary wear and tear, any new damage that occurs before they turn over possession. So they remove all trash and debris from the property and leave the property in broom clean condition. It's very nice to have that in the purchase agreement because otherwise sellers can leave a bunch of trash behind. All right, title contingency. One of the reasons I'm not a huge fan of this form comes here in number 7, in that they don't have the option for an expanded title policy. All they're giving here is at closing, seller shall provide to buyer at the seller's expense an owner's policy of title insurance with or without standard exceptions. Now, to protect your buyer, the without standard exceptions is the better title insurance policy. But this one would likely often requires a survey to be done. And so that's why on some other offer documents, purchase agreement documents, there's the third option of the expanded or Alta or Eagle policy that provides the without standard exceptions, but also does so without needing a survey. And that when I'm writing my offers, that's typically what I used to be checking off, just because I'm asking for my buyers to get the best title policy provided at the seller's expense.
Jordan,
Yes.
is there a way we can add the expanded policy? Like, could we go underneath it where it says proceed to closing, or should we put it in a box 20?
So yes, that's unfortunately doing other conditions, number 32. Putting it there is an option. But yeah, and so that's part of the reason why we may or may not. I'm not totally sure how long we'll be recommending people use this form, because we do want to update our Remax Platinum purchase agreement form, because there's some aspects of that are nicer than this, but there's ways in which that form does not properly reflect the new changes that have occurred regarding buyer agency and all that. And so this is the better form because it's statewide and all that, but we need to be aware of its limitations, and not having an easy way to ask for the expanded title policy, to have to handwrite, well, not handwrite it in, but type it in the other box or as an addendum or something like that. That's just a little bit of a nuisance. Seller will apply for a commitment for title insurance within 5 days of the effective date and deliver the commitment to buyer upon receipt. Any special exception will be subject to buyer's approval, provided that this contingency shall be deemed waived unless buyer notifies seller in writing within 7 days of receipt of the commitment. So, what that means is if you are the listing agent and you have an offer or a purchase agreement on this form, it's in your best interest when you receive the title commitment, send it over to the buyer's agent. Now, and if you're a buyer's agent and you've used this form and you receive that, you actually want to do something with that title commitment. You want to look at it. You want to send it on to your buyer, and you want to see if there's any special exceptions in that title commitment. Because if there are, you only have 7 days to object to that and ask the seller to remedy those exceptions. So, otherwise it will be deemed waived unless the buyer notifies the seller in writing within 7 days of receipt of the commitment. So just keep that in mind. Seller will have 30 days after receiving written notice to remedy any claim defects. If seller is unable to cure the claim defects, buyer may terminate this agreement in writing or waive the defect and proceed to closing. So yes, when the commitment is sent over to the buyer's agent, they have 7 days to object to anything found within it. If they do object, the seller then has 30 days to remedy the claim defect. And if they can't remedy it, then it's on the buyer to choose whether they accept it, with the defect, or they cancel the transaction. All right, survey contingency. This agreement is contingent upon buyer satisfaction with a boundary stake survey to be paid for buyer seller. That may only apply in a small percentage of transactions, but if your buyer is interested in a survey, then then you have this option here. The party paying for the survey shall select the surveyor and order the survey within blank days of the effective date. If buyer does not object to the survey within 7 days of receipt, buyer shall be deemed to have waived this contingency, or buyer chooses not to obtain a survey of the property. So you'll probably be checking this box most of the time. I think if you leave it, unchecked totally, then by default you're kind of, you're not having this contingency apply. So whether you check this box or leave them both blank, it's kind of the same thing. All right, land division contingency, another one that only is relevant if the land you're looking to do divisions and all that. I don't really want to go through everything because it's already 20 minutes into the class. Property inspection contingency. This is very important. So buyer acknowledges that selling broker has recommended that buyer obtain inspections of the property by an inspector and or a licensed contractor. So I know we've already gone over this in a sales meeting, but for those that weren't, in the audience for that, this is a great time to become familiar with what this inspection contingency means, because the inspection contingency is often the most important contingency in a purchase agreement, the one that leads to the most headaches. And so we need to know, have clarity as to what all of it means. This offer is contingent upon satisfactory inspections of the property at buyer's choice and at buyer's expense, no later than 8 days is what I put in of the effective date. So they have 8 days to do any and all inspections and decide if they're okay with it. Now, these inspections may include, but may not be limited to, structural and or mechanical inspections, site investigations, soil borings, well inspections, radon, pests, mold, asbestos. Buyer agrees to return to the property to its prior condition after any inspection, obviously. Inspection contingencies shall be deemed waived unless buyer objects during the time period permitted for the inspections. So that means that they have to object during this number of days Otherwise, the inspection contingency shall be deemed waived. So that's why, yeah, you don't want to put 3 in here just because you think you can get an inspector out there, 3 days from now, because you want it to be that, yes, not only are the tests, the inspections occurring, but you also have time to get and digest the information and make a decision if you're objecting to anything. Because on day 9, if that's when you then find out, oh, there's a major problem, whatever, it's too late by then. So, um, if buyer is not satisfied with the results of any inspection, buyer shall, in writing prior to the expiration of the time frame for inspections, either terminate this agreement or notify the seller of any unacceptable defects identified during the inspections. If seller is so notified, then the seller will have blank days, I think 2 is appropriate, 2 days to notify the buyer in writing of the seller's willingness to correct the defects, credit the buyer a sum of money, or reduce the sale price. So the buyer comes back and says, hey, here's our laundry list of inspection concerns, that we want the seller to remedy. The seller has 2 days to decide how they want to respond, and their response can be either that they will correct the defects, they will credit the buyer a sum of money, or reduce the sale price. Which is kind of strange that those are the 3 options. Upon receipt of notice from the seller or after the expiration of the number of days stated above, if the seller has not responded, then the buyer will have 2 days to elect in writing to accept any offer made by the seller, terminate the agreement, or declare that the buyer will purchase the property in its as-is condition. So there's a laundry list of inspection concerns that buyer requests the seller to do. Seller comes back and says, okay, we'll take care of that one item, but not the others. Or, okay, we'll give you $5,000 off the purchase price. Or seller just ignores it and says nothing. Or they say, no, we're not doing anything. Any of those options doesn't really matter. When the seller has done their response or lack of response, then the buyer has 2 days to accept what the seller has done, walk away and say, no, I want my EMD back. Or, okay, never mind, ignore the inspection addendum. Let's just move forward as it was originally written. So the buyer has the ability to cancel the agreement, but the seller does not at that point. Does all that make sense? Like sending over an inspection addendum does not give the seller the ability to say, okay, we are now canceling this transaction and going with our backup offer. That the seller can't do that in this language. All the seller can do is say, no, we're rejecting your inspection addendum. And then the buyer has 2 days to decide if they still want to move forward or, walk away. Now, if no election is made during this time period, and until such election is made, the contract is voidable by either party. So, I forget if what Bill, his interpretation of that final sentence meant that when we do send over. Does anybody remember what Bill said during the sales meeting on this one? Okay. If no election is made during this time period and until such election is made, the contract is voidable by either party. So I was expecting it to be that if the buyer doesn't make a decision in their final 2 days, then the seller could void the contract. If no election is made. But then I think I ran into this problem when discussing it with Bill. And what he said is actually, yeah, if you do send over the inspection addendum, if the seller does not make a response, it is voidable by them, the contract.
So Jordan, Rebecca just responded in the chat.
Ah,
She said that Bill said that it is voidable up to closing if this isn't adhered to. Like you can continue to move on, but it could be voided.
Right, but I mean the question that during the sales meeting I was trying to get Bill to give his interpretation on a clear yes or no is you send over the inspection addendum during, and then so while the seller has 2 days to decide how they want to respond to it, if they've not yet made an election of any response during this time period, is the contract voidable by them during those 2 days that they're waiting to respond to?
Mhm.
I will have to do follow up on this because I've made this mistake twice now because during the sales meeting I made the same because my reading of it is that the seller can't, but then this final sentence does leave some gray area. Obviously, if the wait, it doesn't say they can void it if it's during the 2 days. Okay. And okay, so that makes sense then. If it is that it's after the 2, then and nothing occurred during those 2 days. But then until an election is made, the contract is voidable by either party. So if the days have passed, and then you're just kind of sitting there in a limbo of, neither side knows what the other side is okay with, and these 2 days and then those 2 days have passed, then either party could void it. I agree with that interpretation. Thank you, Rebecca. All right. Well and septic inspection. The property is served by a well and or septic system and based on its location is subject to mandatory governmental inspection requirements. Seller agrees to order and pay for the inspections within blank days of the effective date if the reports indicate the well and or septic system does not meet the applicable governmental standards that are a condition of sale, or in the event buyer provides written objections within blank days from the date of receipt of the reports. This agreement shall terminate unless the parties agree otherwise in writing. So there are some counties, Ingham County, for example, and I think Washtenaw, right, Rob? Where the seller has to get a septic inspection
Yeah.
before they can transfer ownership of the
Yeah.
property.
Time of sale.
And so
Shiawassee too.
Shiawassee as well. Yeah. So there's Livingston County does not have that requirement. I don't think Oakland does. Genesee, no. But I mean,
Maine.
there are a lot of counties that do. So in those counties where the seller has to get the septic inspection, you'll be checking this box and putting in the days. In, let's say, Livingston County, if there's a well, if there's no well, then you're not checking either box. But if there's a well, then this property is served by a well and or septic system, but is not subject to mandatory governmental inspection. This agreement is contingent upon buyer's approval of a well and or septic inspection of the property by a qualified inspector, ordered and paid for by probably the buyer within blank days of the effective date. In the event the buyer provides written objections within blank days from receipt of the inspection reports. So this is one where up here, this does not care one whit about when you receive the inspection reports for these inspections. But down here, it does give you the option to say, okay, we're going to do the septic inspection within 7 days, but then we have 2 days from receipt of the inspection report to object. So let's say that it's a well and there's a water test, and the water comes back with arsenic, but that's well outside the number of days here and the number of days up here. Well, hey, I mean, you still have 3 days from when you get that water test back, however many days you put in here, to object and tell them, hey, seller, we need to now renegotiate because there's arsenic and we need a whole house reverse osmosis system or something like that. So that's important to recognize that this one is a blank days from receipt of inspection reports. It's not just blank days from the inspection occurring. Does that make sense? Okay. Lead-based paint disclosure inspection contingency for residential housing built prior to 1978. I'm a little annoyed that this one, is in it because The lead-based paint disclosure form itself is a redundancy of this, but that's okay. Buyer acknowledges that prior to signing this agreement, buyer has received a copy of the lead-based paint seller's disclosure form completed by the seller on whatever date. So you'll have to be filling that out. You'll have to pull up the lead-based paint that provided by the listing agent and put that in there. The terms of which shall be part of this agreement. Buyer also agrees, buyer shall have blank days after the effective date to conduct an inspection of the property for the presence of lead-based paint. I don't know about you. I've only once had a buyer in 20 years actually do a lead-based paint test inspection. And so, I mean, typically, 90 something percent of the time they waive that. They're not going to be doing it. But, if they want to do it, it's here. Likewise, though, it doesn't say that. Which has popped up. Anything? Chat?
She said it can be voided any time.
Oh,
It doesn't have to be the 2 days.
Okay. Sorry. All right. So we're property sale contingency. If your buyers have a home, so it's interesting. The amount of information in 13 here. This agreement is contingent upon the successful completion of the following regarding the buyer's property located at. So let's say they have to sell 123 Main Street. All right, 123 Main Street, Brighton, 116. So now we have not yet listed 123 Main Street. And so this offer is going to be contingent upon us getting a signed sales contract on 123 Main Street within, let's say, 30 days. Or maybe we want it to be a non-contingent signed sales contract within 30 days. The difference there is if the offer we accept on Main Street is also contingent, just like we are writing a contingent offer here, if a buyer comes along and wants to buy 123 Main Street with a contingent offer, that would satisfy this box, but it would not satisfy this one because this is a non-contingent signed sales contract. The closing on the sale of the buyer's property within, let's say, 45 days. Now, if you notice, like you change the checkbox, you can't have multiple ones of these checked. So the contingency, you can only pick one of these. And it can be either that you're saying, hey, we will close on the sale of 123 Main Street within 45 days of this offer being accepted. And then that's how long, that contingency is there. All right. Buyer acknowledges that the property is not being taken off the market. That's strange that it won't let you check both of these because this should be already checked. If a backup contract is accepted prior to the satisfaction or waiver of all contingencies regarding the sale and or closing of buyer's property, buyer will have typically 3 days from the receipt of notice of the backup offer to remove in writing all contingencies regarding the sale and or closing of the buyer's property. If this contingency is not satisfied or removed in writing within the time deadline set forth above, either party may terminate this agreement, providing written agreements to the other party. So what's important here is also this bold part. So what all this is saying with regards to, okay, so we've written an offer on Giovanni Court with this one. Yeah, Giovanni Court, but it's contingent on us selling 123 Main Street. Now, if another buyer comes along and writes an offer on Giovanni Court, and then, we have 3 days to remove the home sale contingency of 123 Main Street. Now, if the contingency is not satisfied or removed in writing during those 3 days, then either party may terminate this agreement by providing written notice to the other party. Or if instead we're having one of these check boxes, if that time deadline comes and goes, then either party may terminate. But the removal of any contingency regarding the sale and or closing of buyer's property shall include written verification from the buyer's lender that buyer does not need to sell said property in order to obtain financing for the purchase of seller's property. So that's key, that you need something from the lender stating that selling 123 Main Street is no longer necessary in order to be able to proceed with the purchase of Giovanni Court. Does that make sense? After the buyer has removed all the contingencies regarding the sale of the buyer's property, buyer will be in default if buyer's mortgage is not approved because of the failure to sell buyer's property. So you get notified that another offer is coming on Giovanni Court, and the buyer, your client, the buyers, they're like, well, we still want to buy Giovanni. We don't want to let those other, the backup offer win. So let's remove the contingency of 123 Main Street. And so they convince their lender to give them a letter stating that they don't actually have to sell 123 Main Street to be able to buy Giovanni. And so then they remove that contingency. The letter suffices, because now other purchase agreements state that it's at the seller's sole discretion whether to accept evidence of the contingency being removed. I do like that this one is very specific, saying, hey, it's the lender who's going to state that you can remove the contingency, and the sellers have to accept that the lender's letter. It's not like the sellers could say, we don't actually think you've removed the contingency, because they still want to go with the backup offer. This one takes power away from the seller, and still, as long as the buyers get that letter from their lender, then the buyers can continue to move forward with their offer being the one that's binding. But if they don't close, then, and it's because they can't get their mortgage approved, their financing contingency is no longer something that will protect their earnest money deposit. Does all that make sense? Okay. But I still think you should be able to check this box and these boxes, because regardless of what you're checking up here, this box should always apply as well. So I think this is just a glitch in Remind, that it doesn't let you, that it views this as part of these three, whereas instead it's these three and this one. But oh well. All right, the real estate taxes. This is a good example of why this form is meant to be able to be used across the state, because different counties and municipalities handle their taxes differently. The ones that we, are typically going to be using are the due date proration or the calendar year proration. Due date proration is for counties like Livingston, where taxes are paid in advance. So when you pay your taxes in 2024, that's for the coming year. And so then at closing, the sellers get reimbursed based on the prepaid taxes that they have done. So checking this box means that the buyers are going to be giving money to the sellers at closing for the property taxes. Checking this box is the opposite, in that the sellers still will be, they pay their property taxes in arrears, meaning they, when the first of the year hits or whenever their tax bill is due, it's due for that period that has already passed. And so at closing, the sellers will be giving money to the buyers to cover their portion of the tax, property taxes that have been incurred but not yet billed, because the bill hasn't come out yet, but the calendar days have passed. And so the sellers have to take, be accountable for their property taxes. So calendar year proration is Ingham County. They pay property taxes in arrears. So if you're writing an offer over there in Lansing, then yeah, you want to check this box. Oakland County, Livingston County, Genesee County, I think Washtenaw County are all in advance. Questions there? Now, if you want to keep it clean, like if you could just do no proration and then no money is exchanged. Now, if you're representing the buyers, I would only do no proration. If you're in a county like Ingham County, and where you don't want the buyers having to pay. Oh wait, no. If you were looking out for the buyer's interest, you do no proration. But if you're the listing agent, you're not going to accept that. So yeah, I mean, typically though, you're doing in advance property taxes, due date proration. In arrears, calendar year proration. Okay. Buyers should not assume that buyers' future tax billings on the property will be the same as the seller's present tax bills. That's a good thing not to assume. Under Michigan law, real property tax obligations can change significantly when property is sold. So you have to have your buyers initial that they understand the property taxes may change. What's strange is that there's not spots for the buyers to initial on every page here. It's not one of those that has little buyer seller initial spots down at the bottom, but they do have to initial here. Special assessments. This is another very important one. All special assessments, municipal, association, or otherwise, including future installments, that's the key, including future installments that have been assigned against the property by the date of closing, will be paid by the seller. So if you have a 15-year utility assessment for like a gas hookup that's just in your property taxes every year for the next 15 years, you're paying off that assessment. Well, if you're the seller and you accept this offer, you're paying off the balance of that 15-year assessment. If you're 3 years into it, you're paying off all 12 years at closing. So that's very important to know, especially if you're the listing agent and you receive this on one of your listings. You need to make sure your sellers are aware if they have any special assessments. I mean, if I was the listing agent, I would cross this off then and counter back saying no buyers to assume the future installments of those assessments. Any benefit charges against the property made by any governmental authority or utility company for installation of or tap-in fees for utility services, water, sanitary, sewer, storm sewer, gas, electric, telephone, and cable lines for which charges have been made, incurred, or billed before the date of closing will be paid by the seller. Charges occurred after closing will be paid by the buyer. So this is written to benefit the buyer and put it on the seller to pay off any and all assessments. Miscellaneous prorated items: rent, condo dues, association dues, trash collection, and insurance, as well as interest, will be prorated to the date of close. Okay. Heating and cooking fuels. So if you have like propane in the tanks, that fuel is included in the sale and would transfer to the buyer at the time of possession. Seller is responsible for maintaining heating and cooking liquid fuels at an operational level and shall not permit fuels to fall below 10% in the tanks at the time of possession. So that's a key one. If you're out where they have propane tanks or rather than the natural gas lines, that they have to keep, the sellers are obligated to keep at least 10% in the fuel tank. Seller is precluded from removing fuel from the tanks other than what is depleted through normal use. Closing costs. Seller shall pay all state and county transfer taxes and costs required to convey clear title. buyer shall pay the cost of recording the deed and or security interest and all mortgage closing costs and fees required in connection with the buyer's loan and the insurance of the lender's title insurance policy. All right. All right, we're gonna skip this one because it's already almost all right. We gotta move a little bit more quickly through this. Occupancy. Seller will give occupancy as follows. Now, personally, I think if you're going to have an occupancy situation beyond closing, obviously if you're checking this, that's totally fine. Upon closing agent's receipt of executed closing documents and funds. So getting the keys at closing, that's totally fine. If you're not doing that, then I would personally utilize the occupancy addendum that we have, because I just think that it's a nice document. But if you, because I haven't even fully gone through this. Let's see though. All right, let's say it's 30 days after closing by 12 noon, they'll give possession. Seller will pay buyer $0 per day. That's common lately. Such amount to be paid at closing as set forth below. If seller, if seller fails to deliver possession by the agreed upon date, seller shall become a tenant at sufferance and shall pay buyer as liquidated damages. Make it hurt, $600 per day, plus buyer's reasonable attorney fees. Seller is liable to buyer for damage to the property occurring after the closing before vacating to the extent not covered by the buyer's homeowner's policy, as well as for any deductible portions of a covered claim. Total occupancy paid at closing to be held in escrow by the title company. After seller vacates the property, the escrowed funds shall be used to pay the accrued occupancy charge to the buyer, and the balance, if any, shall be refunded to the seller, or the total occupancy fee to be paid directly at closing without proration. So here, if you were doing, let's say, $100 a day for 30 days, and you did this, then at the closing, the buyer is getting $3,000 for the occupancy charge, even if the seller turns over the keys 4 days later. The seller does not get any of that money back. If you're checking this one, it allows you to check both of these on this, but not on the other. Okay. Then you put in the title company here, and then when they exchange the keys, then a proration would be determined. So I mean, this is adequate, but I still like our occupancy addendum. So I mean, it's up to you. And it does give you the ability to make it hurt if they stay beyond the number of days after closing. It doesn't have a separate damage deposit escrow, because I do think that having a damage deposit escrow helps a little bit, if it's $1,000 or $2,000. So that way then, if damage has occurred, rather than the buyers having to go after the sellers for that damage, I mean, the money's already there in an escrow account, and the sellers have to be a little bit more they can't just ignore the buyers in that regard to what happened with the damage, because otherwise the sellers aren't getting that money either. So, all right, seller's disclosure. Seller has represented that this sale is exempt from the Seller's Disclosure Act requirements. Buyer acknowledges that a seller's disclosure statement has been provided to the buyer. Most of the time you're checking this. Seller shall provide a buyer with the seller's disclosure statement with seller's acceptance of this offer. Pursuant to the Seller's Disclosure Act, buyer will have 72 hours after hand delivery of the disclosure statement to terminate this agreement. So, if you already have the seller's disclosure statement, you're checking this box. Property condition release. Buyer and seller acknowledge that neither party has relied on any representations of the listing broker, the selling broker, or their respective agents concerning the condition of the property. Buyer and seller hereby release the listing broker, the selling broker, and their respective agents with respect to any and all claims relating to the condition of the property and or the performance of this agreement by both parties hereto. So that's just to protect the agents and the brokerages from lawsuits. So finally, now getting to the earnest money deposit. So what's interesting here is, okay, you have a $5,000 earnest money deposit held by, let's say, Remax Platinum. It doesn't reference a promissory note here. If the parties do not enter into a binding agreement, or if the buyer's obligation to purchase is contingent upon ability to obtain a new mortgage or any other contingencies which are not satisfied or waived as provided herein, this deposit shall be refunded to the buyer. In the event the buyer and seller both claim the earnest money deposit shall remain in escrowee's trust account until a court action is determined to whom the deposit must be paid, or until the buyer and seller have agreed in writing to the disposition of the deposit. All right. So, interestingly enough, yeah, I mean, our promissory note that we typically use, I think, is still totally fine, but it's just, we're not, it's nowhere to reference it in this section directly. Default. If buyer defaults, seller may enforce this agreement or may cancel the agreement, claim the deposit, and pursue legal remedies. So, yeah, if the buyer defaults, seller may enforce this agreement. That can be difficult. Cancel the agreement, claim the deposit, and pursue legal remedies. If the seller defaults, buyer may enforce this agreement or may demand a refund of the deposit and pursue legal remedies. This paragraph may be subject to arbitration. It's surprising that there's not more there about what happens if the seller defaults, because the seller defaulting is typically much more consequential than the buyer defaulting. But okay. Limitation. Buyer and seller agree that any and all claims or lawsuits which they may have against the listing broker and its agents and or selling broker and its agents relating to their services must be filed no more than 6 months after the date of closing of the transaction described in this agreement. Buyer and seller waive any statute of limitations to the contrary. What's interesting is a lot of other purchase agreements have a year in here. This one has 6 months. So if a lawsuit occurs, the buyer or the seller, they have to file the lawsuit within 6 months. After 6 months, in theory, you're free and clear. Entire agreement. Buyer and seller agree that this is the entire agreement between the parties and there are no other written or oral understandings. Buyer and seller further agree that this agreement supersedes any and all prior agreements, understandings, or representations made by the parties or their agents. Walk through. Buyer has the right to walk through the property within 48 hours prior to the closing. Confirm that the property and any personal property or equipment being purchased are in the same condition as when this agreement was signed. Ordinary wear and tear accepted. What's nice is for the arbitration section, you have to initial if you're trying to opt into it. So it's by default not opted into, but you can choose it. Electronic communications is written in here, so we don't need the separate addendum for that. Counterparts, heirs, successors. What I wanted to get to, it's already 11 o'clock, but this is important. There's nothing in here that references the buyer's agent compensation. And so we need to always make sure that we're including the addendum to get us paid and referencing it in the purchase agreement. So I have customized my offer document to include having written that already in the other condition. See buyer's broker compensation addendum. So by default, that's in all of my transactions or my offers unless I remove it. But if I don't have that in there, then in theory it puts at risk my ability to be compensated. I think if you were to send over an offer and it's all one PDF and you have the buyer broker compensation addendum included in the PDF and not referenced, I would suspect a court would, back you in getting your compensation, but better to be safe than sorry. Write it here in the other conditions. Likewise, if there's any other addenda, like if you were going to use, the occupancy addendum, what's unfortunate is if you want to mark this up, you have to convert to a PDF, at least in Remind. You have to convert to a PDF and then start, crossing out sections and typing in C occupancy addendum, like here. But once you do that, all of the smart boxes freeze how they are. So that's another thing to be aware of. All right, a couple other things. So the offer expiring. Any questions so far before we get to the final? Interesting. Okay. So receipt is acknowledged. Okay, so here is the buyer's agent, the buyer signing, the name of the agent, ID, that we are representing the buyer only. But now Remax Platinum, if it was a disclosed dual agent as the broker's license, the 6502481, I forget what it is. 48, I don't remember what our our broker's license number is. And then you have the buyer side. So then the seller's response, okay? So they can accept as is, or they can have it subjected to the following changes, and write stuff in down here. What's interesting, seller also agrees to pay the listing broker named below compensation as stated in the listing agreement for the property. So you have the listing agent compensation explicitly referenced here in number 36. But there is nothing explicitly referencing the selling broker's compensation, the buyer's broker. And then, you have the different sellers signed here. And then you have this down here, the buyer's receipt of acceptance. Receipt is hereby acknowledged by the buyer of the seller's acceptance of the buyer's offer. In the event the acceptance was subject to changes from the buyer agrees to accept said changes. So this is necessary if there's a counter offer. But if the sellers have accepted as written and signed, you at that point have a binding contract because you have a contract signed by the buyer and the sellers, regardless of this final bottom line signature. It's not a bad thing to get this signed, but other purchase agreements have it where the buyer's agent can just initial, acknowledge of the acceptance. And so, I think we are flexible in our central that if you don't have the buyer's bottom line, as long as it was not countered, that's totally fine. You as the buyer's agent, I think, can just initial that, receipt of acceptance. All right, that's enough of me talking. Anybody else want to chime in and help get some words? No? Well, then I guess that's going to be it for today.
Hey, Jordan,
Yes.
are you ever going to do the compensation agreement since it's a new job?
Oh, yes. Okay, let me go through that. All right, thank you. I did say I would do that.
You did?
Back to the share. Okay, so we want the buyer broker compensation addendum because we referenced it in our other remarks.
Go back.
So here is that form. And this is the form that's going to get you paid. So addendum to the purchase agreement between whatever the buyer is, the seller, and then the property. The following provisions are included in and supersede any conflicting language in the purchase agreement. In addition to any other amounts which the seller has agreed to pay under other provisions of the purchase agreement, at closing, seller shall pay on buyer's behalf the sum of 3% of the purchase
Compensation
price.
addendum, you're between brokers. You got to get out. You're in the wrong one. Sorry.
So this is having the sellers pay our buyer agent commission, 3%. Okay. And so that's where on the purchase agreement, if you have, right here in concessions, seller to contribute 3% towards buyer's closing costs, and then you also include this, saying that the seller shall pay 3% of the purchase price to Remax Platinum, that's the seller paying 6% to the buyer side, basically. 3% for closing costs, like with their loan origination fees and all that. And this 3% is separate. It's in addition to any other amounts which seller has agreed to pay under any other provisions of the purchase agreement. There's the additional 3% coming to Remax Platinum paid on the buyer's behalf for our buyer broker compensation. So that is, what I recommend just having as your standard is in your purchase agreement, reference this document automatically in number 32, see buyer's broker compensation addendum, and then include that. Because if you
Nick is
don't do
curious.
this, you don't get paid. I'm sorry, what was that, Keisha?
Nick is curious because it shows the compensation between brokers and then the one we just did. He's wondering, they sound like they're similar. Can you explain?
Yes. So the other form, the compensation agreement between, which I don't have in my compensation agreement between the brokers. This is very similar, and this again, you put in here 3%. Now, the big difference is who's signing. On the buyer broker compensation addendum, that is signed by the buyer and the seller. So you include it with your offer, and you have the seller signing saying that the seller is paying Remax Platinum on behalf of the buyer, and the buyer signs that. Okay? This compensation agreement between the brokers is signed by the listing broker agent over here and the buyer broker agent over here. So should theoretically be two different people. And this is saying that the listing broker is going to pay the buyer broker whatever, 3%. Because in theory, the listing broker has a listing agreement collecting 6% from the seller. And then this document says that the listing broker is going to take that 6% and give 3 of it to the buyer broker. Now, some listing brokers don't list at 6%. Some, and so I've had this up here in Fenton, agent saying that the listing agent was only offering 2%, but now my buyer's agent had a contract in place for 3%, and she was writing a strong offer. So I told her to not negotiate on your 3%, that your buyer is obligated to pay 3%, and they don't have the money to bring to closing. And so it needs to be part of the purchase agreement in order to benefit, to have it be that the entire buyer's obligation is satisfied. Now, using this form, if she were to put in the 3%, then in theory, the listing broker may be cutting their percentage, the extra 1%, in order to go from 2 to 3 here. This form would be a little bit easier to get signed regardless of what the listing agreement says. If the listing agreement has 3% going to the buyer side, then the compensation agreement between the brokers should be easy. But if the listing agreement says anything else, then this is the easier form to get signed, because then it's the seller acknowledging they're paying 3% to the buyer's agent, and then it's between the listing agent and that seller to make sure they're on the same page of, hey, even though we listed at 5%, offering 2 or 2.5 to the buy side, we're giving 3 to the buy side. You as the listing agent aren't also getting the 5%, just because we're paying, me as the seller is paying the buyer agent directly the 3%. You as the listing agent don't get to keep all 5% we listed at. Instead, you need to still only get the 2.5 that you agreed to accept as the listing side. Does that make sense? Or, I mean, it's so you have the choice between these two. It depends on the listing agent and their willingness to sign this document. If you can get the listing agent to sign this doc showing that you're getting 3%, then yeah, listing agent signs here, you sign here, and everything is wonderful. And it doesn't even need to, then be a discussion, because I mean they've already agreed to it. But I mean, it's getting listing agents to sign this may be more difficult than getting sellers to sign this. That's my only. I don't know. I've yet to. I'm not out there writing offers, so I don't know the real world experience of it. Thoughts or questions?
No, thank you.
Okay. All right. Well, thank you all for hopping in on this. Wow, we're up to 12 participants. I've just droning on, didn't see all the different people logging on. I apologize for some of the confusions in that, but yeah. So I guess I'm going to stop the recording, and then